Welcome to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. To riff on the great American novelist James Baldwin, not to be a bankster in this economy and to be relatively conscious is to be in a rage almost all the time. Oh, but to be a bankster in this economy and to be relatively conscious is to be abandoning ship at this time. Stacey.
Max, you and I here on the Kaiser Report have been raging for the
Rage! 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 Right on, that's my rage. It's about rage. Rage is okay. Yeah, rage is good. Rage is happening.
Is that the gospel according to Max Kaiser?
Let the rage out. Don't keep it in.
Well, we've been raging since last summer when all the signs were pointing to an imminent collapse, and in fact that it was collapsing much like the Lehman days. Well, finally, the banksters are also recognizing an abandoning ship, anybody connected to banksters. And we see this first headline here: Noonan sells his own euro shares to invest in gold. Bearish minister hedges against euro deflation. So the Minister for Finance bought the traditional hedge against tough times by buying into the SPDR Gold Shares Exchange Fund over the last year, according to Noonan's latest declaration to the unpronounceable Gaelic word, which detail his private financial interests. The grim outlook for Europe's economy last year seems to have inspired the minister's decision to sell out of a fund that tracked European shares.
Shillelagh stick? Is that the unpronounceable Gaelic word?
No, it looks like Oryctus.
Oh, that's what you find in Michael Noonan's Schwing. That's where he's storing the gold. Because,
yes,
of course, he's one of the guys who contributed to the collapse of the European economy, the collapse of the euro, the collapse of Ireland. So he knows full well that now it's time to store some gold in his Schwing or his Erectify or Erecticus, according to the Gaelic tradition. You know, the leprechauns of yore, of course, it wasn't a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. It was a Michael Noonan Schwing stuffed with gold bars at the end of the rainbow.
Well, he is, of course, buying paper gold, and he's ditched all his holdings on the top shares in Europe. So make it of it what you will, but it looks like he's abandoning ship, and the following headlines suggest he has good reason to. The surging dollar is a signal that a colossal financial event is just around the corner. The dollar is set for the biggest quarterly gain since 1992, when Britain was the ERM exchange rate mechanism. They were ejected from that as they tried to maintain that to a peg with the Deutsche Mark. And George Soros made $1 billion in one day. Well, it's soaring as fast as during that period of time. In the past, significant dollar gains against other currencies have pretty much happened only during periods of extreme financial or geopolitical stress. The last 4 large dollar shocks in the past 40 years have been symptoms of huge financial events: the collapse of Lehman, Britain's panicky ejection from the European rate exchange mechanism in 1992, the first Gulf War, and Paul Volcker's shock rate hikes in the early 1980s.
Well, I'll use my Titanic metaphor. So, in other words, the global economy hit the iceberg in 2008. The Titanic of the global economy, and started to sink. At some point, the stern of the boat, if you recall from the movie, the stern of the boat goes vertical. That can be equated to the US dollar going vertical, and all the top 1/10 of 1% are scurrying up to cling to the rails of the stern. And it's going up, and they're going, oh my God, we're making so much money. But once the dollar peaks out, once the stern hits the apex of its vertical move, then it will plunge along with all the poor people that are already sinking. The lifeboats in this case would be gold. And of course, there's very few lifeboats available. And what would you pay for a lifeboat if you were sinking on the Titanic? You would have paid $1 billion for a lifeboat. What are you going to pay for gold once it's clear that the dollar is now sinking with every other currency, fiat currency in the world? $10,000 an ounce? $15,000 an ounce? We'll see.
Well, according to the Bank of America report about the dollar surging, they say that today's surge is already considerably larger than the one surrounding Lehman's collapse, although the economic conditions are very different. So they're suggesting that the economic conditions are better now, of course, because the Dow is rising, and they say that job numbers are looking better in the United States. But then that takes me to this headline here: American mystery story consumers aren't spending even in a booming job market. So this is from Bloomberg, and they say that the chart below shows retail sales and payrolls generally move in the same direction until now. That divergence could portend lower levels of economic growth if Americans' usually reliable penchant to spend is less than what it once was. In the chart, the blue is the payrolls number and the red is the retail sales. As you see, it looks like, or at least the government says, they're surging job numbers, and yet retail sales are collapsing. So one of those numbers doesn't quite add up.
Well, of course, it's exactly like the Lehman collapse and the 2008 collapse. It's an extension of that collapse. And to say that there was a recovery is false, because the debt has only skyrocketed here in the United Kingdom, for example. Under Osborne, the debt's more than doubled to 1.6 trillion pounds. The deficit is basically where it was when it started. So that's, if there was any kind of recovery in any of these countries, they would be raising rates. But of course, they're dropping rates because they are tracing this collapse down into the gutter of this currency war. And they're also doing is, flooding the market with paper gold futures contracts to keep the price from reflecting this, except in the Brazilian real, gold is now at a new all-time high. Obviously, against the ruble, it's doubled in the last year. It's within 10% of hitting a new all-time high in euro and in yen. I predict that they will shortly hit new all-time highs. Then it'll become very clear that, the only lifeboat available, as Michael Noonan has already figured out, that scoundrel up in Ireland, he's going to say, look, we hit the iceberg, and all my tricks and all of my fraudulent activity is for naught, and I'm going to start buying gold.
You mentioned Brazil, and there have been big protests there, including 1 million people were out this past weekend protesting the economic conditions there as inflation is soaring. As you said, the gold price is rising to an all-time high against the Brazilian real. Over in the United Kingdom, here's another shock that people just don't understand. They refuse to look at the real numbers. We're at that point at the end of the Soviet Union where they had massaged and rigged the numbers for so long that nobody in charge understood. Even the CIA, looking at the Soviet Union, didn't know it was about to collapse. And I think we're at that same sort of spot in time right now where it seems like we're on the verge of a historic event, but people don't seem to be aware of it because the numbers have been rigged and faked for so long. And that is decline in UK house building accelerates drop-off in construction activity. There's actually been a plunge in house building here in the UK, despite all of these programs from George Osborne, from Help to Lend, Help to Buy, to now this new program where they're suggesting if they win, they're going to give a 20% discount to first-time buyers. And the biggest cause of this plunge has been first-time buyers have just evaporated. They're not coming into the market despite all of these programs for them, because the problem is incomes are down 10%, and house prices continue to rise and rise and rise and rise.
I mean, the way to build an economy is to have a diversified economy so that you have different sectors and they are competing for capital and they're building an economy that has some dynamism to it. But here in the UK, there's really it's a one-trick pony. It's the housing property bubble, fed by the financialization going on in the City of London. That's it. There is no other industry of any size here in the UK. Maybe you could say in the car industry a little bit. But other than that, it's just price bubble. So it's a one-trick pony. So it's like Detroit. Once the cars business moved out of Detroit, Detroit went into free fall. Now, once the city loses the ability to commit massive financial fraud with the help of quantitative easing, the entire economy will collapse. It'll be Detroit on the Thames.
They actually note that it's basically a one-trick pony and they only have property prices and speculation to drive this economy. And Osborne had alleged that by the end of this government that they would have some sort of they would diversify, but that hasn't happened. And they say that making matters worse for the Chancellor, the recent GDP figures showed business investment growth has slowed in the last quarter of 2014 to a rate not seen since the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis in 2009. So once again, a number which cannot be massaged, which cannot be manipulated, which is the investment by businesses into the economy, has plunged to looked very similar, quacks like the duck of the collapse of 2007, 8, and 9.
We've seen what happens in this economy. They feed the price bubble in housing, and then that housing is used to boost consumerism. Now, what's amazing, I learned over the past week, is that the small to medium enterprises in the United Kingdom, most of them acquire their first initial funding by leveraging their homes. So here's another way that George Osborne's price bubble in property is hurting the United Kingdom, because these instead of building out a robust startup culture like Silicon Valley or Silicon Alley in New York, they've allowed for this incestuous relationship to exist between property bubble speculation and the small to medium enterprise and the startup culture. So now when the bubble bursts in housing, all the collateral available for startups will also collapse. And that's a direct result of Osborne's malfeasance as a chancellor, his economic illiteracy, if you will. He only knows one thing: hit the property bubble button, go, 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 and that's it. That's his only policy.
On LBC radio this past weekend, I was listening to a report where they're saying 500,000 more people under this coalition government are now on housing benefit, rely on housing benefit. 500,000. It's now 5 million people in the United Kingdom, nearly 10% of the population that relies on housing benefit. And the coalition has made it more difficult for young people to get housing benefit. So primarily they said this is over 35s now having to turn to housing benefit. Their families, and they're working families, so maybe both parents are working, but they're not earning enough to actually afford housing, so the government is having to pay part of their housing costs, which is of course mostly going to private landlords, because there's not much public housing left.
Yeah, this idea of austerity is a hoax. There has been no austerity except for folks that are having their money stolen from them and given to fat cats through the mechanism of 0% interest rates. So all the savings money that would be getting a return on savings and the wages that would be competitive with inflation, all that's been scooped up and given to the top tenth of 1%. I mean, this guy Cameron has pretty much failed on every single one of his campaign promises. Remember, he was going to cut the immigration numbers. They've skyrocketed. He was going to cut the housing benefit numbers. They've skyrocketed. He was going to eliminate the debt. It's gone up, more than doubled. He was going to diversify the economy. It's still the same old monoculture, mono property speculation bubble, which is about to burst again. So what did he say he was going to do that he did? Absolutely nothing. He's a complete and utter failure.
Like I said, the numbers are showing or lying to you for one thing, but the reality around you is showing something different. And that's why to be conscious is to either be raging, or if you're a bankster, abandoning ship.
Let the rage go. The rage, let it out. Rage. Oh, we got to go.
Rage!
Ooh. All right, well, stay tuned for the second half. I traveled to a special studio to talk to Tariq Nasheed.
Ukraine's very delicate balancing act. To the surprise of many, the ceasefire designed to de-escalate Ukraine's civil war is holding. Nonetheless, there are many reasons to remain skeptical.
Dramas that can't be ignored. Stories others refuse to notice. Faces changing the world right now. A full picture of today's news. Live, on demand, from around the globe. Rockley.tv.
How crucial was this consideration, do you think, for Russia in retaking Crimea back? The fact that it was the home of the Black Sea Fleet.
Our president, Mr. Putin, has explained that the main concern of Russian Federation was to protect people. Russian fleet was another one of the concern, but not the main.
Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. Time now to turn to TV personality, radio host, and lecturer Tariq Nasheed. Tariq is also a producer and director whose latest film is the crowd-funded Hidden Colors Tariq, welcome to the Kaiser Report.
Pleasure to be here, Max.
Okay, fantastic. So you're in London. What are you doing in London?
I'm in London. I'm doing a lecture at Friend's House, and I'm talking about the international rules of racism.
The international rules of racism.
Yes.
Now, it seems as though race relations in America have taken a serious nosedive down. It seems like black people are getting shot in the street.
Yeah.
It's almost like lynching is legal again in America with Ferguson. And what's going on?
Well, ever since the election of President Barack Obama, we have a black president, and that gives the illusion of power for the entire black community, which it's not. Remember, it's just an illusion, but that illusion is enough to make those in the dominant society who practice what we call white supremacy to have a pushback and retaliate. And since they cannot retaliate against President Barack Obama himself, they retaliate against other black people. And any type of progress in the black community has always been met with this retaliatory type of vengeance from the dominant white supremacist society.
Right, so this term white supremacist, it goes back really to looking at race and going back really thousands of years. There's always been almost in the DNA of one group of society, a fear of another group in society. And you use this term, which is interesting, melanated.
Yes.
So melanated, I mean, going back to the origins of the human species, it comes from Africa.
Right.
And then as migration up north, the melanation is lost essentially,
right?
And you end up with a white person.
Absolutely.
So when I'm ever in a group of folks where I detect racist overtones, I always say, we all come from black semen,
Yeah.
and that generally gets a response, and they're like, wait, why are you, when you're disrespecting blacks, your mother, if you go back enough generations, was black. So you're just disrespecting your mother.
Right.
But so this term melanated is one that you use, and white supremacy is one that you use in this context.
Right. And I use that because white supremacy goes back 500 years. Before 500 years, there was no concept of race because most people on the planet were melanated people. Now, the Europeans who live here in what we now know as Europe, they were depigmented. And when they started to discover the world after 1492, and they realized that most of the planet is populated by melanated people, my conjecture is they came up with a system in order to maintain their survival, which is a system that they will have to dominate those melanated people. And this is where we get the genesis of white supremacy.
Obviously, most of the riches of the world come from Africa,
Right.
all the mineral wealth, and et cetera. Now, going forward, you are a big advocate of economic warfare as opposed to political warfare.
Not even warfare, just economic empowerment, because we already have economic warfare being waged on melanated people. See, that's how white supremacy works. The system of white supremacy is based on depriving melanated people of resources. So there's already economic warfare. So to counter economic warfare coming from the dominant white society, and let me be very clear, all white people are not white supremacists and all white people are not racist. Unfortunately, the people who do practice white supremacy have proven to be more powerful than the ones who are not. So we live in a system that we are being dominated by race, and part of that domination is economic deprivation, and that is what's been happening to melanated people for 500 years.
You don't have to be a racist to benefit from white supremacy.
Absolutely.
In other words, there's white supremacists who are using their white supremacist techniques to aggregate the world's wealth. And white folks in that category can say, well, I'm not a racist, but I am still benefiting from the system.
Absolutely. And a lot of people think just because they're not beating a black person upside the head, that doesn't mean that they're not a racist. And white supremacy goes deeper than that. Racism goes deeper than that. Racism is more systematic. And that's the thing that makes it so cohesive and so difficult to combat, because you can't point to a person and say, okay, that person right there is white supremacy. It's a global system which has the participants of a lot of different people. And a lot of people try to reduce racism, white supremacy to the Klan or the skinheads or a white extremist group. These are white extremists. But a white supremacist is any person who believes that they are systematically better or superior to melanated people.
Well, clearly, you've got a prison industrial complex, as some call it, America,
Right.
which benefits from having most of young black population is incarcerated.
Not most of them, but just a lot. A high segment of young black people are incarcerated. But we have to understand this. Racism itself is a prison. Racism is slavery. See, when we talk about slavery, we talk about antebellum slavery, which is the picking the cotton in the South. But even after that, black people were still subjected to Jim Crow, which was another form of slavery, sharecropping, which was another form of slavery, the civil rights movement where we couldn't go anywhere, which was another form of slavery, and economic deprivation is another form of slavery. So slavery just keeps changing faces. The prison complex is the exact same thing as slavery. So instead of calling black people slaves, well, they're criminals. So everything we do has to be criminalized, and that's what Jim Crow was about. Everything a black person did was criminalized, and we would be criminalized for things that white people wouldn't be criminalized for, such as looking out of a window or drinking from a water fountain. And even now, black people gathering in large places.
Selling Lucy's on single cigarettes on Staten Island and get choked to death.
Yeah, and he wasn't even selling cigarettes, by the way. Let's be very clear. Eric Garner was not selling cigarettes on that day.
He's choked to death on a video by cops,
but
and
he was
that seems to be okay now.
But he was criminalized. You notice they kept bringing back criminal, and that justifies treating people who are melanated like slaves. So we have to really understand the context of what slavery is.
Let me, speaking of slavery, let's talk about the economics of slavery, because there was a movement that's come and gone in the black community for reparations, because black community, the slaves in America built up the economy, and the reparations are owed, you know, depending on how you do the numbers, between 25 and 30 trillion dollars.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, using economic techniques, let me run an idea past you and see if this would qualify, get your thoughts on it. Why couldn't a representative from the black community go to a bank on Wall Street and say, we're going to sell reparation-backed bonds, backed by these trillions of dollars worth of reparations. We're going to sell them now. We're going to take the cash, and we're going to spread that out all over America to get our interest in office. And then once we get our interest in office, pass laws to make reparation the law of the land, and that's how we're going to pay off these bonds. Isn't that a great way to use that asset, to securitize it, use the tricks of Wall Street to do the warfare back, or the technique.
Empowerment. I use the word empowerment because, again, black empowerment is not about waging warfare on anybody. It's about just empowering your community so you're not subjected to systematic white supremacy. And there are many techniques on how to get reparations. The big argument is should reparations be given, because a lot of people come up with excuses. Well, I wasn't there, or slavery was so long ago, or Africans enslaved other Africans. So there's so many different excuses, but there are many tangible ways to distribute reparations to the black community. You can do it with land. You can do it with the casinos, just like with the Native Americans. Some of the tax money can be allotted for that. There's a lot of money in the U.S. economy that the government use, and they can use some of that surplus income to distribute to people for reparations. So there, and bitcoins, there's a whole bunch of different ways to distribute reparations, but the whole argument is, should it be done? And it should be done.
Well, it can be done because there's a banker on the end of that deal who'll take the money. You know, banks have no sovereignty to anybody. If you say you can make $20 billion by packaging reparation bonds and put them on the international markets and get Moody's to give them a AA rating, you know, you're in business. You know, that's a great way to transfer wealth back into the black community from where it came. That's where the wealth came from.
Right, exactly. But the thing is, are the bankers going to transfer that money back to the black community? So I think a lot of times...
Yeah, you show them a paycheck. You don't think of Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan. Jamie Dimon, if you show up in his office and say, here's $1 billion to go do black reparation bonds, he's not going to say, I don't know, I got to think about that. He's going to be like, yeah, hell yeah.
But yeah, JP Morgan and these corporations and these bankers, they're already making money off black people. When they give out welfare and EBT cards, which people try to pretend is a bad thing, you have to understand the EBT cards, those are owned by the banks. So when you swipe those cards, the banks get paid from that. So they're already making money off us, but we don't know it. So we need to...
That's a good point. They're already cashing in.
They're already cashing in.
JP Morgan does issue the food stamp cards.
Absolutely.
And then they create the economic conditions that need the food stamps.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about the prison business for a second, because the U.S. incarcerates as much percentage of the population as did the Soviet gulags at the peak of the 1950s.
Yeah.
Now, in the Soviet gulags, there were ideological and political prisoners. In the U.S., it's mostly blacks.
Absolutely.
I mean, I said most young blacks are in prison on a regional basis. You have to drill down, but it's obviously an extraordinarily high number. Americans champion those in the Soviet gulags. You know, there's a huge outcry. Well, how come Americans don't give a flying rat's you know, about the American gulag of blacks?
Because what you have on the news every day is black people are thugs, black people are criminals, black people deserve to be incarcerated, and this is what happens. Black people get incarcerated primarily because of the economic deprivation. We don't have an economy to combat the judicial system that unfairly targets us. And also we have to understand the judicial system and the prison system is slavery. They make money off the slave labor. In federal prison, it's mandatory for people to work in prison. You just can't go to prison and sit up and just chill for 20, 30 years. You have to work or you're going to get put in solitary confinement. So they make money outsourcing the work of the prisoners. So we're back in slavery again. It's
So
just been
slave
reworded.
system in the prisons, lynching in the street, cops are lynching people.
Absolutely.
Lynching's legal.
Absolutely.
If I can shoot a black man in Florida and say I'm standing my ground.
And you'll become a millionaire because other white supremacists will donate money to you like they did George Zimmerman, like they did Darren Wilson, like they did the cop up at Long Island. So you can become not only wealthy, you can get freedom and you can become a hero in the system of white supremacy by killing black people.
You know, to chart the graph of success of the civil rights movement, as it's called in America, in the 50s and 60s, you had the repeal of many of the Jim Crow laws.
Right.
You had legally rights given. And then it seemed in the 70s to kind of peak, if you will. And for 20, 25 years, black community has been going backwards in a lot of ways. To me, it seems like there's a lack of leadership because when people talk about the black community issues, they always go back to the Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton, and these are dinosaurs from decades ago. Where's the new, young Malcolm X, Martin Luther King? What's going on?
Dead. They shot all our leaders, and that's what happens. We don't need another leader in the black community. That's the last thing we need. We don't need any more leaders because there is no leader in the white community. There is no leader in the Jewish community. There is no leader in the Asian community. They all work together and create a system of empowerment for themselves. In the black community, we're told, just get you another leader so we can kill them. So we need to get a system of empowerment and a code of conduct so that we can get real tangible empowerment. See, the civil rights movement was actually a failure. It wasn't a success because there was nothing that was tangible from it. There were a bunch of symbolic gestures. They said, okay, you have the right to vote, but you don't have the money to back up your vote. And what happened, they put a lot of token politicians in cities as mayors during the 1970s, especially in the city where I live in, Los Angeles. They put in Tom Bradley. He was the mayor from 73 to the early 90s. And at that time, the gang problem was at its peak. In all of these cities, they would put these black mayors in Detroit and these black politicians all over the place, and they would keep the economics within the white community, so the black communities went to hell and they had a black face to put on top of it. So we have to be very careful by understanding the rules of white supremacy.
All right, we got to cut it off there. Tariq, thanks so much for being on the Kaiser Report.
Thank you so much.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of the Kaiser Report with me, Max Kaiser, and Stacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Tariq Nasheed. If you want to tweet us, you can do so. Tweet Kaiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.